Hello. The purpose of this video is to talk a little bit about the Freakonomics podcast, to introduce you a little bit to the readings for tomorrow, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, to talk about an important concept in those readings, which is anchoring, and to also talk about the results from what at the time seemed very perplexing experiment that we ran during new student orientation involving that virtual roulette wheel. So, one of the things that hopefully you learned during the listening to the Freakonomics podcast is that we are essentially of two minds. We have a system two mind, which is very thoughtful and can be rational, in which we weigh benefits and costs. But it is, of course, very costly to think so hard about everything. So as a result, we've also developed this system one mind. And the system one mind relies heavily on simple rules of thumb or heuristics that allow us to make decisions easily and cheaply. But of course, the problem with that is that we also are a machine for jumping to conclusions. We make predictable mistakes. We are often predictably irrational in the way that we think about things. One good example of this is that we tend to be overconfident in our thinking. We tend to be excessively high opinion of the accuracy of our predictions. We tend to make emotionally biased observations. And so, as I said, a good example of this is what economists and psychologists call anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is the fact that arbitrary numbers influence the path of bargaining and price setting. So, if I'm negotiating with you or bargaining with you over the price of a good, interestingly enough, that initial offer plays a big role in where we end up. Even though that really shouldn't be true, right? If we were really going at this rationally, what you offer me initially really shouldn't influence where we end up. But in fact, that often happens, right? And so to kind of test whether anchoring bias actually exists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky back in 1974 conducted an experiment. And in this experiment, they had people spin a roulette wheel. And then after they spun the roulette wheel, they recorded the number that they got, that they spun. And then they were also asked what percent of countries in the United Nations were from Africa. Now, here's the trick to the experiment. The roulette wheel was rigged. It wasn't a real roulette wheel. It only came up with 10 or 65. What's interesting, though, is that those people who saw a 10 consistently predicted a lower percentage of countries in Africa than the people who saw a 65, who consistently predicted a higher percentage of countries in Africa. And so that is anchoring bias. This piece of irrelevant information, like what a roulette wheel says, influenced what we predicted, or what people predicted about how many countries in the United Nations were from Africa, right? And so that is essentially the experiment that we were trying to recreate last week during new student orientation, where we asked you to spin a virtual roulette wheel. We didn't tell you it was rigged, though. It was rigged to only come up with 10 or 65. And then we asked you a couple of questions, including that question of what countries, or what percentage countries in the United Nations were from Africa. So let's take a look at our results and see if we suffered from anchoring bias. All right. And I want to thank Megan Goldberg, who put together all these results and these data visualizations for us. So first off, we see here are the results that we had 201 observations, and just about 100 of people saw 10 and about 100 people saw 65. There were a small number of you who reported seeing a number other than 10 and 65. And so I'm a little worried about you people, but we'll just hope it was a typo. So half of you saw 10, half of you saw 65. The next question was, is the percentage of African nations among the United Nations larger or smaller than the number you entered? Well, notice that for those of you who saw the smaller number, relatively few of you thought there were less than 10% of the countries in Africa were from the United Nations. For those of you who saw the bigger number, a lot of you thought that less than 65% were from Africa. So this seems like a pretty rational behavior, right? If you have a bigger number, then you thought that it was more likely that the number was lower than the bigger number that you saw on the roulette wheel. But here's what we were really trying to get at. What is your best guess of the percentage of African nations in the United Nations? And look at the difference. That for those of you who saw 10, you thought about 24% of the countries in the United Nations were from Africa. For those of you who saw 65, you thought 42% of the countries in the United Nations for Africa. That is a significant difference. And interestingly, this is very close to the results that Kahneman and Tversky got way back in 1974 when they ran this same experiment. If you actually look at the distributions, right, the pink distribution is for those who spun at 10, and the blue distribution is for those who spun at 65. And you'll see that that blue distribution is definitely shifted to the right, meaning that there are consistently higher guesses for those who saw the 65 than for those who saw the 10. And this is statistically significant difference between the two groups. So yes, we as a group are guilty of anchoring bias, right? But to say guilty means we're no different than anybody, right? Everybody, even trained economists, right? Even trained psychologists can be guilty of anchoring biases, because this is what happens when we don't turn on those system 2 brains, right? And it happens all the time when it comes to negotiation, right? So, you know, when I think about anchoring bias, I think about the students that I take to China every other year. I'm an economist, and we take a class to China where we study the Chinese economy. And in China, bartering is very common, right, for all sorts of goods, much more common than it is in the United States. And so it can be exhausting to barter all the time. But one of the things that really, I think, kind of shocks our American students who go there is they always ask, why is it that they always make an initial offer that's 4 or 5 times what we will eventually agree to? Why can't they just kind of make a smaller offer and we can get to the end more quickly? The reason is because time has shown that if you make a higher offer, you'll end up at a higher price because of anchoring bias, right? That initial offer puts the seed in our brain that something is worth more than it otherwise would be. And so that's why anchoring bias is so prevalent, and why it often gets used so much in things like negotiation. Related to anchoring bias is the concept of framing, which you'll also read about in Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And framing refers to the fact that we are influenced by information at hand rather than by the probabilities at play, right? So to say this in another way, maybe the easiest way to understand framing is to think about an example. I'm a manager at a store and I'm trying to sell a TV set, a specific brand of TV. How do I do that? Well, one of the things that managers and marketers have learned over time is if you put a television set right in the middle between a high-priced TV and a low-priced TV, people are more likely to buy the medium-priced TV, right? And this is irrespective of the actual characteristics of that TV, right? The features, how big it is, whatever, people tend to go for the one in the middle. And so all the time, people's decisions can be framed by kind of irrelevant information that is put around it, right? Politics is a lot about framing, right? If you're having a discussion about the inheritance tax, you know that somebody who refers to it as a death tax is trying to get you to think one way about the inheritance tax, and somebody who refers to it as an estate tax is trying to get you to think about the inheritance tax in another way, right? Because, you know, death has a pretty negative connotation, right? So anyway, these are some of the phenomena that we will talk about as we continue to talk about Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow.